The thing about humans, Council Arbiter Senvara Dulthi had always believed, was that they were predictable. Emotional, yes. Impulsive, certainly. But in the end they always came back to the table. Every species did. That was the first and most sacred law of the Galactic Council of Accord. All conflicts, regardless of scale, ultimately resolved through negotiation. That law had held for 9,000 years. Until the morning Ambassador Rael Corvinus walked out of the Grand Chamber and didn't come back. Senvara replayed the security footage from her private console in her quarters on Deck 9 of Velarath Station, a sprawling orbital structure built specifically as neutral ground. No atmosphere, no gravity signature that favored any one species, no cultural architecture that could be read as favoritism. It had taken 400 years to build and 700 more to agree upon. It was, by any measure, the greatest diplomatic achievement in galactic history. And in that footage she watched Ambassador Corvinus, tall even for a human, dark-skinned, with close-cropped gray hair and the quiet eyes of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything, set his translator badge on the circular council table, look directly into the surveillance lens as though he knew exactly where it was, and say 8 words in unaugmented standard English. "We're done talking. You will hear from us." Then he walked out. No rage, no tears, no last-minute hesitation. Just the soft hiss of the chamber doors and the echo of his footsteps diminishing down the marble corridor. The council had waited 3 hours before someone dared to speak. That had been 6 days ago. Since then, every attempt to re-establish contact with the human delegation had been met with silence. Not technical failure, the communication channels were live and verified. Silence. Chosen, deliberate, absolute silence. The human frigate that had carried Corvinus to the station had departed within the hour. No flight path logged. No destination declared. Just gone into the dark of space with a course that folded under FTL before anyone could track it. Senvara set down her cold cup of kelver broth and stared at the star map projected above her desk. 47 member species of the Accord. 12 observer states. 112 years of human membership, the shortest in council history, and the first species to ever voluntarily terminate it. Her console chimed. The glyph of High Regent Vetziel of the Thurani, a bioluminescent cephalopod species whose tentacle script had been one of the first translated by early galactic explorers, flickered into view. Vetziel's translated voice arrived in smooth, measured tones, but Senvara knew the Thurani well enough to read the stress patterns in their chromatophore shifts. The High Regent was frightened. "Arbiter Dulthi. The emergency session convenes in 40 minutes. We need you to chair." "I will be there," Senvara replied. "Has anyone reached Corvinus?" A long pause. Vetziel's skin flickered through 3 shades of pale amber, which translated roughly to deep unease. "No. Nor the secondary delegation on Proxima Accord. Nor the human trade envoys on Solaris Meridian. Every line of human communication has gone silent simultaneously. This was coordinated, Arbiter. This was planned." Senvara stood, straightening the formal sash across her shoulder. She was Drelesi, a tall, silica-scaled species from a high-gravity world, with compound eyes that processed 11 spectrums and a lifespan 3 times that of a human. She had been an arbiter for 160 years. She had mediated wars between hive minds. She had negotiated the Kesavari boundary accord that had prevented the extinction of 2 species simultaneously. She had looked into the faces of despots and monsters and held her composure like a stone holds warmth. But something about those 8 words, calm, direct, final, settled in her chest like a cold stone. She murmured to herself, they had been planning this departure for some time. She thought of the human histories she had studied when they first joined the council. A species that had once nearly exterminated itself through war and ecological collapse, then somehow managed to bootstrap civilization, reach the stars and arrive at the council table with more raw technological data than any first contact species in recorded history. Species who survived the kind of crucible humanity had went one of 2 ways. They either became deeply pacifistic, traumatized into softness, or they became something else entirely. The humans had always been difficult to categorize. She was beginning to understand why. In the Grand Chamber 40 minutes later, 53 ambassadors from 47 species sat in concentric rings around the central podium. The human seat, seat number 12 by historical assignment, was empty. It had always been a slightly unusual seat. The human delegation had always requested a chair with a lower back than standard, claiming the taller designs blocked their peripheral vision. A small thing. An odd thing. Now it looked like an accusation. Senvara called the session to order and reviewed what they knew. 6 days prior, The Council had voted on Resolution 7741 Gamma, the Kathrani Expansion Clause. The vote authorized the Kathrani Consolidated Authority, a powerful four-species bloc from the galactic core, to extend sovereign claim over 3 mineral-rich star systems currently designated as protected development zones for the Morvi, a pre-FTL species on the cusp of their first space age. The Kathrani needed the minerals. The economics were sound. The Morvi had no vote and no representation. By Council rules, the vote had been legal. Ambassador Corvinus had voted against it. So had 3 others. The resolution passed 38-4. And then the humans had walked out of galactic civilization. The question hanging over the chamber, unspoken but enormous, was not why they had left. It was, what were they going to do next? Kathrani Prime was a world of engineered beauty. Its cities were grown rather than built, crystalline structures cultivated from the planet's naturally occurring mineral forests, rising in geometric perfection above plains of violet grassland. The Kathrani were meticulous, long-lived, and supremely confident in their position as one of the founding species of the Galactic Accord. They had helped write the original charter. They had contributed more to Council infrastructure funding than any other bloc for 800 years. Director General Fiavris Yulan, the 4th eldest Kathrani alive, with a body like articulated obsidian and eyes that refracted light into private rainbows, was not accustomed to being made to feel uncertain. The silence from humanity was making her feel uncertain. She stood on the observation deck of the Consolidated Authority's administrative tower and looked out at the skyline of Kathrani Prime's capital, Veth Solara. Somewhere beyond that skyline, beyond the star systems her species had called home for millennia, there were human worlds. Dozens of them. Colony stations. Shipyards. Research platforms. The humans had expanded with quiet, relentless efficiency over the past century, asking for little, noting everything, filing few complaints and fewer requests. She had always found that restraint suspicious. Other council members had found it reassuring. Now, the silence had broken open a particular piece of intelligence that her Strategic Advisory Corps had been sitting on for 3 months, unsure of its significance. She was looking at it now on the transparent display panel before her. The humans had spent the last 11 years buying up decommissioned ship hulls from 6 different member species. Quietly. Through intermediary trade companies registered in neutral systems. The purchases were individually small enough to avoid council review thresholds. Collectively, they represented enough raw material to construct a fleet. Not a war fleet, the analysts had initially argued. The hull designs were retrofitted for cargo and construction. Probably an expansion initiative. Probably perfectly legal. The word, probably, had been doing a great deal of work in that report. Her chief strategic advisor, a young Kathrani named Sothril Vane, angular and sharp in the way the youngest generation always was, full of pattern recognition and short on patience, had updated the analysis this morning. He entered the observation deck now, holding a data slate with both primary manipulators. New signal intercept from the Morvi system, Director General. She took the slate. Stared at it. 3 days after the human walkout, a fleet of 47 vessels had arrived in the Morvi home system. Not warships. The hull registry, pulled from old commercial filings, identified them as modified construction platforms. They had formed a perimeter around the Morvi's single inhabited planet and its 2 resource moons. They were not armed as far as anyone could scan. They were, however, enormous. And they were broadcasting on an open channel, open enough that even the pre-FTL Morvi could pick it up on their radio telescopes. The message was in 17 languages simultaneously, including 3 Morvi dialects that the Accord's Xenolinguistics division hadn't even fully catalogued yet. The Human Translation Corps, it appeared, had been busy. The message said, the Morvi system is under the protection of the Terran Continuance. Any attempt to extract resources from this system or its moons will be interpreted as an act of aggression against a protected developing civilization. The Terran Continuance does not recognize the jurisdiction of the Kathrani Expansion Clause. This is not a negotiating position. This is a statement of fact. No signature. No ambassador name. Just the words, repeating in 17 languages around the clock. Fiavris read it 4 times. Terran Continuance, she said slowly. They named themselves. They have a new governance structure. We believe so, Sothril said. The name has appeared in 3 other intercepts in the last 48 hours. A trade renegotiation attempt with the Thurani, the humans declined and referenced the Terran Continuance as the refusing authority. A border survey request from the Lorvashi Commonwealth, denied, same reference. And a scientific expedition permit for the Crestfall Nebula, approved, but rebranded under Terran Continuance licensing, not Council filing. They hadn't simply left the Council. They had built something to replace it. Or rather, they had been building it for years and had simply been waiting for the right moment to unveil it. Call an emergency session, Fivers said. The Arbiter has already called one, Sothril replied. For tomorrow morning. Fivers set the data slate down on the railing and looked out at the glittering spires of Veth Solara. In 9,000 years of galactic history, no species had ever done this. No one had ever walked away from the Accord, rebranded their governance, deployed a protection fleet around a pre-FTL species, and done it all without firing a single weapon or raising a single voice. The humans had not ended diplomacy. They had simply stopped participating in the version that didn't work. She found, to her considerable discomfort, that she did not know what to do about that. New Carthage Station had been built in secret over 9 years, which was, given the scale of the project, something of an engineering miracle. It occupied the gravitational sweet spot between two gas giants in a red dwarf system that the Council's cartographic database had classified as uninhabitable and commercially unviable. That classification was, it turned out, wrong on both counts. The station was not beautiful in the way Kathrani cities were beautiful. It was beautiful the way a well-made tool is beautiful. Purposeful, dense with intention, every surface serving a function. Its outer ring housed shipyards and fabrication facilities. Its middle ring contained agricultural bays, residential modules, and the kind of infrastructure that said this was meant to last. Its inner ring, protected by overlapping shield arrays, contained the offices of the Terran Continuance Council, which, unlike the Galactic Accord, had only one member species. For now. Rael Corvinus sat across from Director Primaris Isolind IV, a compact, silver-haired woman from the Martian colony with a background in systems engineering and exactly zero patience for ceremony, and finished giving his debrief. He had been talking for 2 hours. She had not interrupted him once. When he finished, she sat for a long moment looking at her own hands. They'll call it an act of aggression, she said finally. They'll call it whatever helps them avoid dealing with what we actually did, Corvinus replied. Which was protect a species that had no other protection. 47 ships is a significant deployment. 47 unarmed platforms with construction capacity and a communications array. We haven't fired on anyone. We haven't threatened anyone. We've stated a position and shown we have the capability to back it up. He paused. That's not aggression. That's deterrence. The Council has been using deterrence for 9,000 years. They just don't like it when it's aimed at them. Force stood and walked to the observation window. Beyond the transparent aluminum, New Carthage's outer ring rotated slowly, a visible reminder that everything here worked, everything was real, everything had been built by human hands and human minds over years of quiet, careful preparation. The decision to leave the Accord hadn't been made by Corvinus in that chamber 6 days ago. It had been made years earlier, in rooms like this one, by people who had read the same reports and reached the same conclusion. The Galactic Council of Accord was a magnificent institution with a fundamental design flaw. It was designed to protect the interests of species who already had power. The Morvi were not the first pre-FTL species to be used as a resource colony by the Accord's more powerful members. They were the 37th by the Continuance's own documentation. Humanity had spent 11 years quietly cataloging every such case, building the legal and moral framework that would let them act when the time came. And then they had done something unprecedented. They had waited for the moment when the injustice was undeniable, voted against it openly on the Council record, lost the vote, and then demonstrated that losing a vote did not mean accepting an outcome. Not through war. Through the simple, infuriating, historically unprecedented act of showing up with a better argument, backed by the resources to make it real. What are they going to do? For asked. Options are limited, Corvinus said. They can't attack us without fracturing the Accord. Too many member species would see aggression against a former member as a precedent they don't want set. They can try economic sanctions, but we've been building trade relationships outside the Accord's preferred channels for 6 years. And they can't just ignore us because we're currently sitting in the middle of the Morvi system telling anyone who will listen exactly why we left and exactly what we stand for. They'll send an envoy, For predicted. Yes. He nodded. And when they do, we'll receive them. We're not refusing communication. We left the Accord's table. We didn't leave the galaxy. She turned from the window. In the years since she had taken the Director Primaris post, she had given countless speeches, signed hundreds of formation documents, overseen the construction of what was arguably the most ambitious non-military project in human history. She had believed in all of it. But seeing it actually work, seeing a fleet arrive in the Morvi system and hold the line without a single shot fired, filled her with something she struggled to name. It wasn't quite pride. It was something older and quieter than pride. It was the feeling of being, finally, consistent with your own values. Prepare a formal reception protocol, she told her aide. The council will send someone within 10 days. I want us to be ready. She paused, then added, and send a cultural liaison to the Morvi system. They just watched 47 alien ships appear in their sky. Someone should explain what's happening, in their own language at their own pace in a way that doesn't terrify them. That, perhaps more than any fleet deployment or diplomatic declaration, was the thing that separated the Terran continuance from the institutions it had left behind. Somebody had thought to ask what the Morvi needed. By the 12th day, the emergency session had stopped being an emergency and started being a referendum on everything the Accord believed about itself. Senvara Dulthi had chaired enough difficult sessions to know the difference between productive conflict and circular self-destruction. What she was watching now was tipping dangerously toward the latter. The chamber was divided in ways she had not seen in her long career. Not cleanly divided, the fracture lines were strange and ragged, cutting through old alliances and old enmities alike. The Kathrani bloc was furious and defensive, arguing that the expansion clause had been passed according to established procedure and that any unilateral human action to obstruct it constituted a breach of peace. 3 other core system species agreed with them. Loudly. The Thurani, however, and this had surprised everyone including Senvara, had issued a quiet but pointed statement noting that their own review of historical council votes revealed a pattern of resource allocation that systematically disadvantaged peripheral system species. They stopped short of endorsing the Terran continuance's actions. But they did not condemn them either. 6 smaller species said nothing at all, which in council politics meant everything. The Lorvashi Commonwealth, whose ambassador was a meticulous elderly being named Keth Savran with 7 decades of diplomatic experience, asked for the floor and delivered what Senvara privately considered the most important speech of the entire session. Keth Savran spoke for 12 minutes. They reviewed the 37 pre-FTL development zones that had been reclassified as resource territories over the past 400 years. They pointed out that in 35 of those cases, the reclassification had been opposed by a minority of council members who were then legally bound to accept the outcome. They noted that the Accord Charter contained no mechanism for a member species to object to a majority decision through action rather than speech. And they asked, with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime using language as a precision instrument, whether a law that produced unjust outcomes consistently by design was still entitled to call itself law. The chamber was very quiet after that. Senvara called a recess and used the break to send a private message. Not to the Kathrani, not to the Thurani, not to any of the 47 members currently seated in the chamber. To New Carthage Station. The reply came within 6 hours, faster than she had expected, which itself told her something. It was from Rael Corvinus, who she suspected had been waiting for exactly this kind of communication. He did not offer to rejoin the council. He did not apologize for his departure. What he did offer was something she had not anticipated, an invitation. The Terran continuance would receive a council delegation at New Carthage Station. Formal diplomatic protocol. Full honors. They would listen to whatever the council wished to say, and they would speak plainly about what the continuance was, what it intended, and what kind of relationship it was willing to have with the existing accord. He added one line that she read 3 times, each time feeling it settle somewhere deeper than professional calculation. We didn't leave to be enemies. We left to be honest. She presented the invitation to the resumed session that evening. The reaction was, as she had expected, divided. The Kathrani rejected it as legitimizing an illegitimate entity. The Thurani immediately volunteered to join any delegation. Keth Savran of the Lorvashi asked to be included personally. By the end of the night, a delegation of 7 species had agreed to travel to New Carthage. Senvara included herself. Not as arbiter. The Accord's rules were unclear on whether an arbiter could engage diplomatically with a non-member entity, but as an observer. In a private capacity. She told herself this was a professional assessment. She was not entirely sure that was true. What she knew, with the certainty that came from 160 years of watching species navigate impossible situations, was that something had shifted. Not just in galactic politics but in the underlying logic that galactic politics ran on. For 9,000 years, the assumption had been that all conflicts ultimately resolved through negotiation, and that negotiation meant working within the existing structure. The humans had introduced a third option. Not war. Not negotiation within the system. Build a better system. And then show up with it. That idea, once introduced, could not be unintroduced. She could already see it moving through the chamber like light through a prism, splitting into spectrums that the original design had never accounted for. The Council of Accord was not finished. But it was no longer the only story being told. The reception hall of New Carthage Station had been designed by a team of architects who had studied the ceremonial spaces of 43 different species and then deliberately incorporated none of them. The result was something genuinely new. A large, well-lit room with circular seating at equal heights, no raised dais, no central podium, no symbolic architecture of hierarchy. Every seat was at the same level as every other. The council delegation entered in formal procession and then visibly didn't know where to sit. That had been intentional. Rael Corvinus, serving as lead representative of the Terran continuance, waited until everyone had sorted themselves out and then simply sat down in one of the available chairs, not at the head of the table because there was no head of the table, and said in council standard, "Welcome to New Carthage. We're glad you came." Arbiter Senvara Dulthi, attending in her unofficial capacity, watched from the observation gallery above. Beside her stood Director Primaris Iceland IV, who had invited her personally through a separate channel, a gesture whose significance was not lost on Senvara. The humans were communicating on multiple levels simultaneously. It was a very human thing to do. "Your hall has no symbols," Senvara observed. "We have symbols," Fa replied quietly. "We just chose not to display them in a room where we're meeting species whose symbols we might accidentally insult or misread." She paused. "We have a whole department dedicated to exactly that kind of consideration." Below them, the opening statements began. Ambassador Keth Savran of the Lorvashi spoke first, as the senior council representative. They began unusually not with a formal position statement but with a question. They asked Corvinus to explain in his own words, the moment he had decided to leave the chamber. What Corvinus said in answer would later be transcribed and distributed across 47 member species news networks, read by billions of beings, argued over in academic halls and street markets and legislative chambers. He spoke for 11 minutes. He described the vote not as a legal failure. The vote had been legally conducted, he acknowledged fully, but as a demonstration of what happens when a system optimizes for procedural legitimacy at the expense of actual justice. He described watching the Morvai's fate be decided without their knowledge or consent as something that produced in him a kind of clarity he had not felt in years of careful, respectful rule-following diplomacy. He said, "I have spent my career believing that the table was the answer. That if we could just keep everyone at the table long enough, keep talking long enough, the right outcomes would eventually emerge. And I still believe the table matters. But a table that is designed so that the same voices always win and the same voices never speak is not a negotiating table. It is a theater of consensus with a predetermined script." No one in the room spoke for a moment after that. Then the Thurani ambassador, a young being named Rethivas Klanovalaris, attending their first major diplomatic session, asked the question that broke everything open in the right way, "What kind of table are you building instead?" Four from the gallery leaned forward slightly. Corvinus took a document from the folder in front of him and slid it across the circular table. Copies appeared in front of every delegate simultaneously, a logistical detail that had clearly been prepared in advance. "The Charter of the Terran Continuance," he said. "Open to any species. Founding principle: no territory may be claimed from a pre-technological civilization without that civilization's future ratified consent. No vote on resource allocation may pass if it disadvantages a species with no council representation. Dispute resolution through binding arbitration, not majority vote. Economic participation structured to prevent any single bloc from holding structural veto power through funding." He paused. "We've been working on this for 11 years. We knew the day would come when we would have to decide whether to keep pretending the existing system could reform itself from the inside, or whether to build something that started from different first principles." "You built it first," Keth Savran observed, "before inviting anyone in." "We did," Corvinus agreed. "Because we knew that an invitation without demonstrated viability is just a wish. We needed to show that the thing we were proposing could actually be built." The negotiations that followed, and they were genuinely negotiations, not the council's brand of procedural theater, lasted 4 days. By the end of the first day, the Lorvashi had formally requested observer status in the Terran continuance. By the end of the second, two smaller species who had sat silent through the council's emergency sessions sent separate messages to New Carthage requesting information about membership criteria. The council delegation did not dissolve or defect. That would have been too simple, and history rarely provides simple resolutions. But when they departed on the fifth day, they carried something back with them that had not existed 21 days earlier: a formal dialogue protocol between the Galactic Council of Accord and the Terran Continuance, establishing mutual recognition, agreed-upon communication channels, and a joint working group to review historical resource zone decisions. It was small. It was procedurally tortured. It represented about 14% of what either party actually wanted. It was a beginning. Sinvara remained on New Carthage for 2 extra days after the delegation departed, with Four's permission. She spent the time walking the station's corridors, eating in its communal dining halls, sitting in on 3 different public meetings: a habitat expansion committee, a curriculum review board for the station schools, a heated debate about noise ordinances in the residential ring. On her last evening, she stood at a viewport and watched the 2 gas giants rotate through their slow orbital dance. A young human engineer, no more than 30 years old, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had grown up knowing exactly who they were and what they were building, paused beside her. "First visit?" the engineer asked. "Yes," Sinvara said. "What do you think?" She considered the question with the care it deserved. She thought of the circular chamber with no head. Of the charter that had started from different first principles. Of Rail Corvinus setting his translator badge on the table and walking away, not in defeat, but in the full, measured confidence of someone who had prepared a better answer and was finally ready to show it. She thought of what it meant to watch a species that had arrived at the council table a mere century ago, young by any galactic standard, rough and loud and barely past their own near extinction, look at 9,000 years of accumulated institutional wisdom and say, with complete seriousness and not a trace of arrogance, "We think we can do this better." And then actually demonstrate that they could. "I think," Sinvara said slowly, "that in 160 years of diplomatic work, I have never encountered a species that manages to be simultaneously the most infuriating and the most instructive to deal with." The young engineer smiled. "We get that a lot." She returned to Velarath Station the next morning. She had a report to write, careful, thorough, honest, for the full council membership. It would recommend formal recognition of the Terran Continuance as a sovereign political entity. It would recommend a structural review of the Accord Charter's resource allocation provisions. It would recommend, delicately but clearly, that the Council consider what it means when the species most recently admitted to your institution is the first one to show you that your institution has a design flaw you've been unable to see for 9,000 years. It would not recommend that the Council become the Terran Continuance. That would be wrong, and she knew it. Different species needed different structures. The genius of what the humans had done was not that they had built the only right answer. It was that they had proven there could be more than one answer. That the table was not sacred. The table was a tool. And tools could be redesigned. The science and philosophy behind the story. This story explores themes drawn from real political science, diplomacy theory, and organizational behavior. The Galactic Council of Accord represents what scholars call institutional path dependency. The tendency of institutions to preserve their original design even as circumstances change around them. The human strategy depicted here reflects concepts from political theory including exit, voice, and loyalty. The 3 options available to dissatisfied members of institutions. Where most species in this story chose voice, speaking within the system, or loyalty, accepting outcomes they opposed, the Terran Continuance chose a structured form of exit, combined with the construction of an alternative that made their exit productive rather than merely symbolic. The Morvi situation echoes real historical cases of indigenous and developing peoples whose resources were extracted by more powerful actors through technically legal but fundamentally unjust processes. A reminder that procedural legitimacy and actual justice are not always the same thing. The story's core question, what do you do when the rules are followed correctly but the outcome is still wrong, is one of the most important questions in ethics, governance, and international relations. There are no simple answers. But as this story suggests, asking the question honestly, and being willing to build toward better answers rather than just argue about the current ones, is where meaningful change tends to begin. Thank you for reading. If this story made you think about institutions, justice, diplomacy, or what it means to build something better, then it has done its job.